Hi, welcome to our next to last presentation in the Sustainable Solutions Seminar Series, co-sponsored by the School of the Environment, Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and the Department of Architecture. We are happy to have today Dr. Alan Yeakley, Professor of Environmental Studies at Portland State, and a panel of students who are going to be presenting work on an IGERT grant that they have had looking at the complex problems of urbanizing delta regions. And they've spent some time in Netherlands working with a group of scholars, European scholars, on trying to address some of these issues. So I'm going to like to present Alan Yeakley, and he will present to you the panel of students. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. So this is going to be a little bit of a difference from maybe a traditional seminar. I'm not going to present a study and some results and give you the findings. This is more of an ongoing collaborative process, and you're going to see maybe right in the middle of the sausage being made about how we're trying to think about this in a collaborative way with 5 different countries, students from 5 different countries, thinking about a common problem, but looking at it from different disciplinary ways and trying to come together around a framework which can then address what we call wicked problems, and they will describe this in more detail, existing in and around delta regions. And so my big job is just to introduce the students, because this is really a student-run project, and so they have the spotlight. So I'd just like to mention all of their backgrounds and tell you a little bit about them, and then I'll hand it over to them. In no particular order, Basma Mohammed is going to be presenting part of it, and she's coming to us from Duke University, a master's there, and I can't remember the undergrad. Tufts University, so East Coast. And then we have Marissa Matzler, who comes to us from Oregon State and Yale University. She's starting this past year, along with Basma, in the IGERT program. And then we have Sarah Holman, who also from Oregon State University and then from Portland State, and is another IGERT trainee who just started this past fall. And then we have Jody Schuenen, who comes to us from lots of places, right? University of Washington and Cornell, yes. And she's also an IGERT trainee. And finally, Kelly Cowan, who is in the engineering technology management. He's a doctoral candidate in that program, and he has a master's in undergrad from the University of New Mexico. So you can see quite a diverse array of expertise coming to bear. And then if you put these 5 together with students from Germany, from Sweden, from Indonesia, and the Netherlands, you've got quite a mixture of expertises and backgrounds that are trying to approach this framework. So I would like to then turn it over to them to present. So, Marissa Matzler.
Thanks. Just to give you guys a little taste of the rest of the group that we have here. So there's 4 different teams that we are actually coordinating with at the moment. Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands is actually heading up this whole project that we'll be describing to you here. So we really have a lot of different groups that we're coordinating with, a lot of early/late meetings working with the time change and that kind of thing. So it's been a really fun process. So just to give you a taste of the Netherlands here. We're also working with a client. We've been working with the Delta Alliance, which is an international network that is interested in delta regions. And they're interested in deltas for a variety of reasons. They're very highly productive areas, very unique ecosystems are present there, and they also provide a variety of services for humans, both economic, ecological, and social. So what exactly is a river delta? Just to get everybody on the same page, here's some satellite images of a few different river deltas. A river delta forms when we have a river that meets a slower moving body of water. So for example, a lake or a reservoir, or in the case of the deltas that we're looking at, the ocean. So you can see if I can get my pointer working here. Aha. So here's some beautiful delta regions from the Netherlands. This is Zeeland in the Netherlands. And you can see as the water is flowing down through the river, it's picking up everything around it. A lot of sediments and nutrients are flowing with the water down to the ocean, and when it gets there, it slows down, and therefore it doesn't have enough energy to keep moving that sediment. So you have these beautiful plumes of sediment right here that over time form delta regions. And so that is the focus of our study here. That's the ecosystem focus of our study. Sorry, I'll get myself situated. So one iconic river delta that you guys might be familiar with is the Nile River Delta. And you can see down here it has this very classic V shape. And this is a really wonderful example of how deltas have provided services such as fertile soil, biodiversity, connectivity, all sorts of ecosystem services for thousands and thousands of years. So we've had successful settlements in delta regions for quite some time, and they continue to develop. So there are really large urban centers that are now centered on river deltas. Now they're urban river deltas. So while these deltas, living in these deltas really provides some amazing opportunities, there are also a lot of ecological trade-offs that come into play when you're living in a delta region. For example, seasonal flooding becomes very important, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, waterborne disease also becomes an issue in these regions. Also, when you start to think about all of the water that's flowing off of the entire watershed ends up there in that delta region. So you end up with a concentration of pollutants from all of the activities throughout that region. So there's really a complicated system of trade-offs that you have to look at when you begin to discuss these places. And these trade-offs result in a variety of wicked problems. So a wicked problem is really something that is a problem that is associated with a complex system. And these complex systems have a myriad of complicated feedback loops. And really what this means is that any solution to any one problem in these regions can lead to a variety of new issues and problems. So for us working in these regions, it really means that there's no one right answer to sustainable development in a delta. It's really just this series of trade-offs. So that's really the entry point for our group here. The team really recognized, and the group at Radboud University, Radboud Honours Academy, I apologize, really recognized this need to deal with trade-offs, and so has assembled this team to focus in on some of these important issues. So our client, Delta Alliance, tasked our group with assembling an integrated approach to sustainable urban delta development. Now, this presentation, as Dr. Yeakley mentioned, is really going to highlight the steps of the process. We're right in the middle of this right now, so we're really going to talk to you about the process that we're currently going through. I'm just going to begin with a brief overview of the steps, and then my colleagues will dig in a little more. So really what we're looking at is review, integration, and application. So we began our review with our trip to the Netherlands. All of the teams convened there to really observe case studies from around the country and see how the Netherlands is dealing with some of the wicked problems in their own deltas. When we returned to our home countries, we began to review various sustainability frameworks. There are a lot of tools that are out there right now that could be helpful in delta-specific approaches, and so we didn't need to reinvent the wheel here. So we really started to draw on the experience of our home institutions. And we're currently involved in this second step, the integration step, where we are assembling these framework ideas and case studies into a document that is really describing an integrated approach for this sustainable development. That will lead us into our third and final step. In April of this year, we will be reconvening all together in person here at Portland State University. So all of the teams that that we introduced at the beginning, will be traveling here to go through a series of workshops to really complete that integration step, really complete our document and get a solid approach to then apply to a very specific case in Indonesia. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that at the end. But first, to kind of dig into this review step a little more, Jody and Basma are going to share some of the lessons learned straight from the Netherlands.
Thanks, Marissa. So, as Marissa discussed, we started with review when we were in the Netherlands. We're now in integration, and we're moving forward to application in April. So I'm going to take us back to the review part, which is basically when we flew over to the Netherlands, spent a lot of time discussing, and then hopped on a few buses over a course of a few days and went and toured various projects. So the Netherlands is a country built on the idea of keeping the water out. So it's a huge focus. Part of the land is below seawater. Part of it is about a meter above seawater. So there's a huge emphasis on building dikes and other structures to keep the water out. A few factors that are causing a cultural shift or a kind of a worldview shift are climate change and sea level rise and sinking land. And there's a process of building up higher dikes, but people are realizing that that's not a great solution because if the dike breaches, it's a huge risk for people living there. So a national project that's happening right now, it's being implemented at present, is called Room for the River. And it's essentially a river widening project that's going on at a national level. And it's an example of a collective countrywide path forward with a lot of stakeholder involvement. And when we were there, we were able to go visit at least, we visited 2 different sites along the Room for the River. And I'll talk about the first one, which is Overdiep Sepolder, and then Basma will talk about the Millingerwald afterwards. So here's an overview map of the Room for the River project plan. You can see it's enormous. It basically started with 700 potential sites that were put on the table, and 39 were selected, and then 35 were taken forward for implementation. They run along the gradient from being completely urban to agricultural to restoration-based, and they run along the entire river delta up into the watershed. The implementation period has been from between 2009, it'll go to 2015, and the money for the project has been committed up front, which means it's not subject to annual appropriations, and that ultimately ends up saving the country a lot of money. The entire budget for the project is 2.3 billion euros, which equates to about $3 billion US. And the project Overdiep Sepolder is right here, kind of in the lower area that I'll talk about. We had heard a little bit about this project before we actually got there on the bus, and it didn't sound that extreme, and then you show up and you realize it's pretty extreme and pretty interesting. So basically, it's a grassroots effort of a bunch of dairy farmers to respond to a government plan for Room for the River. So the government plan was that they wanted to move a dike. So the farmers are located right here. The plan was to move this dike back, which would increase flooding in this farmland. So this area is called a polder, and it's basically an area of low-lying land that's been reclaimed from a body of water by dikes. So if they were to move the dike back, these farmers would get flooded, and that's not a great solution, obviously. So about 18 of them got together, and they came up with a plan and brought it forth to the government agencies and said, okay, you can do it, but here's what we request. And what they requested was that these mounds be built, right here, and that they could set their farms on top of the mounds, and then when the river, when there were high flow events and the river flooded, their property would be protected above the water level. And then when the other, 90% of the time, when it's not flooded, they could use that land for their animals. About 9 of the 18 decided to take this option, and about 9 decided to move their farms to other locations within the country. Here's a plan view of the same process, and you can see here the little mounds that they're on, the farms are built on, and this image is showing a high flow event when the water's coming in. And then here is an example mound with the animals down in the agricultural area and the house protected up on an area. Here's another view, kind of an artist rendering. On the left is when there isn't a high flow event, and then on the right is when a picture of what it would look like in a high flow event. So the reason we wanted to show this was because it's a great example of the power that stakeholders have in contributing to a public process and discovering these sustainable solutions to some wicked problems. So we got to meet with the farmers. It was just a great day. It was really interesting and inspiring to hear their stories. So again, over Deep Sepulchre right here. Moving on up the watershed, Basma's going to talk a little bit about another project that has a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences.
Just going to get situated here too. So I'm going to talk to you about, so Nijmegen is here. Over Deep Sepulchre was on the other side of the city. And on one of our days, we drove east of Nijmegen to this area, which is zoomed in over here, which is now a nature reserve. So they removed a dike along the River Val and just sort of allowed a few hundred hectares to flood and to sort of return it to the floodplain of the Val. And it's called Millinger Ward, and essentially it's a created area of green space not that far from the city, and the community is right next to the nature preserve, which is this community here, Millinger, and then this community down here, Kirkendam. They actually have a tourism boom now occurring in these small towns. So restaurants have opened up to cater to people who come to visit the nature preserve. So it was an interesting case study. And then when we were actually touring the reserve, it's not necessarily managed for invasive species. So the understory is just kind of going through succession, and all of the tall plants right here are invasive impatient species to the Netherlands, or non-native species. But then that means that the reserve is a place of high biodiversity, which is sort of an ecosystem service provision for this part of the Netherlands, which is largely surrounded by old industrial and agricultural lands in these smaller towns. So here, this is a brick factory that is actually destined to become decommissioned right next to the reserve as part of the river widening project. And the River Val is right adjacent to the nature preserve, so people have a view of the water and can walk right along it, and also see all the ships go further up the Val to Germany. So this is just to reorient you to that, and you can actually on Google Maps even see all the ship traffic. So this was just an interesting area to visit, because there aren't that many national parks in the Netherlands. So there are about 20 total national parks, but this is a smaller nature preserve that is providing a lot of cultural and community services, if you will, to Nijmegen and the surrounding towns. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Kelly, who will talk to you a little bit more about that integration step that we are proceeding forward with the students abroad.
All right, so thanks, Basma. So like Basma said, for the next stage in this project, we had to look at how do we integrate this whole process together. How do we take what we've learned and move forward? And for dealing with the kinds of projects that they've presented, some of the sustainable development projects, and for addressing some of the wicked problems that have been kind of alluded to, it's often common to look at different frameworks, sustainable development frameworks for making decisions. And now I realize that a lot of folks who come to sustainability seminars are probably familiar with some of these frameworks, but I was going to spend just a little bit of time going through these. And for the purposes of this project, we really had to relate them specifically to some of the wicked problems being handled in urban river deltas. So I'm going to try to address it on that level. So let's see. Probably the most common definition that you hear for sustainable development is the Brundtland definition from 1987. Folks are probably familiar with that: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is obviously a good definition, but one issue is that when you're dealing with urban river deltas, this definition is a bit heavy in its orientation toward resource development, whereas in deltas we're looking at a lot of issues related to ecosystems, and we just need to add some additional considerations for the resilience and integrity of living systems, for the special role that these places play, some of the social sustainability measures like equity and well-being of local people. So we're just trying, as we're thinking about all these lessons learned and how do we proceed forward, how can we define these things in ways that really address all the key needs that are important that we've learned about in these regions. And generally, like I say, a framework is used to analyze this. Frameworks consist of tools, methods, models, ways of trying to evaluate development impacts and different project outcomes. So frameworks also tend to evaluate factors along a number of dimensions, including economic, social, environmental, and cultural dimensions. So here are some examples of some common frameworks for sustainable development that have been created over the past 50 years. We show about 30 of the more common ones up here. And there are many different ways you can categorize them. In this case, on the X and Y axis, we've got integrated and selective and visionary and actionable. The colored circles also represent some of those dimensions of sustainability that I was mentioning: the environmental, social, economic, cultural. But the key point that I'm trying to make, just throwing up a bunch of these frameworks here, is that there are a lot of these that are good for very specific types of problems that you're going to try to solve. But for any one problem that you're looking at, there's probably no one framework that's just going to be the right answer for solving those problems, because this depends greatly on the types of values that you're trying to emphasize, the kind of outcome that you're trying to achieve. So what we're looking at here is how do you look at the most appropriate frameworks or combinations of elements from different frameworks that can be put together for solving the types of wicked problems that we've mentioned in urban river deltas. And we focused primarily on this upper right-hand quadrant of frameworks that were considered integrated and actionable. But even in that quadrant, there's quite a bit of variation. So if you look at some of the frameworks like the living principles of design and the Presidio model, these are primarily frameworks that deal with issues related to product design. And obviously, that's just one type of challenge that you might face in some of the projects. Other frameworks involve things that emphasize specific dimensions of sustainability, and some frameworks deal with, they try to deal with a whole range of issues. They try to be kind of all-inclusive. But our goal here is really to see, which of these plus elements of others might be useful for solving these types of problems that we've been seeing. And if you look at the arrow here, we focused in on two categories, two main types of frameworks that seemed highly relevant in the situation. We looked at natural capitalism and the natural step. And in fact, because we were trying to deal with issues like biodiversity, human settlement, kinds of economic activity that occurs in deltas, and the sensitivity to the impact of those activities, we drilled further down into some of those frameworks. And we looked at, for instance, in the case of natural capitalism, closely related concepts in ecosystem services, and in the case of natural step, the flexible framework for strategic sustainable development. So our team members also had strong skill sets in these areas, and the next phase of this process involves taking a look at this. And now to tell you just a little bit more about these frameworks and how we're putting this all together, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
Thank you, Kelly. Oops. So as Kelly mentioned, we're really focusing in on two of the main sustainable development approaches, and one of those being the natural step. Now, the natural step, within the natural step, there's this strategic framework for sustainable development. And this is really guided by the natural steps 4 principles of sustainability. You can see these principles of sustainability summarized on the slide. I actually stole this right from the Natural Step website, if you're wondering where that came from. And these really emphasize reducing the actions that will put pollutants into our biosphere, both man-made and natural pollutants, as well as reducing the amount of physical degradation we do to our surrounding ecosystems. And in addition, they really emphasize avoiding actions that will have high social costs or undermine a society's capacity to be resilient in the face of change. So again, these are kind of very broad general principles of sustainability that this framework really focuses on through the process. And it has a very well-developed process. Again, that's known as FSSD, also the Framework for Strategic Sustainable Development. I'm really focusing in on that. Now, to complement this really well-developed sustainable planning process, we have brought in this concept of ecosystem services. Now, I'm sure this audience is very familiar with the concept of ecosystem services as laid out in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, also discussed by Costanza, Daly, and others. And this really provides a holistic language as well as structure for approaching these sustainable problems and solutions. So as we talked about a little earlier, these wicked problems in the urban river deltas are really multidimensional. And so to try to find solutions and be innovative, you need to have a multi-dimensional approach to really evaluate the social, the cultural, the ecological, and the economic trade-offs, thresholds, and impacts that these decisions may have. So we are really in the conceptual phase of integrating these two ideas along with some other approaches that we've reviewed. And we're really focusing in on the well-developed process of the natural step, that strategic framework for sustainable development, and this structure and multidimensional language that ecosystem services provides. We're really hoping that by integrating these two concepts, we can broach some of these wicked problems and in these urbanizing delta regions. Like Marissa mentioned earlier, these wicked problems are multidimensional, and so if you have a narrow focus, you may not fully comprehend the total number of trade-offs or impacts your decision will have. And so to innovate sustainable solutions in these areas, we really need to have this holistic approach and a robust process. So as I said, this is really in a conceptual phase right now, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this integration and creating this approach in the spring school, and Marcia's going to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so this is really leading us into our final step here, the home stretch, which is the application of our approach to a very specific case study. So wicked problems are very context specific. And our client is an international organization, as I said before, that's really looking for a tool that's going to be able to address wicked problems around the world. So while we are very Delta specific, we are also looking to create this generic framework that can be used in a lot of different contexts. And so Indonesia will be our case study, our application site, which we will address in the spring school. Indonesia comes with its own specific set of wicked problems. Specifically here are a lot of public health issues. They have quite a few disease epidemics that are very related to water. Dengue fever, which is transmitted via mosquitoes, is of urgent concern in many areas. And these are just devastating epidemics that need to be dealt with immediately. And so really using the approach in this kind of setting really tests the bounds of what it can do. And so we feel that a comprehensive approach is really going to be critical when you start to look at some of these things. As Sarah was mentioning, this narrow approach can really lead to a lot of negative effects further down the road. For example, dealing with mosquito populations, one very popular method to do this is to begin draining a lot of your wetlands and your marshlands. But now we know that this can have a lot of negative ecological effects that really impact human well-being further down the line. So we're working to provide this integrated and holistic view that can really give a clearer definition of all the trade-offs on the front end. So as you're approaching these problems and looking at the solutions, you could really have a more robust idea of what you're getting into. So we're really looking forward to digging into this further in April. As I say, we're still working on this, and probably right now on the other side of the world, someone is busily working on our document. I know it. So it's been very fun to coordinate around the world and really get this multicultural perspective, and also learn about how to deal with the time change, deal with communicating with all these different group members. And I really think that it's going to pay off big in the end. So we'd just like to thank all the people that helped us out here, especially Radboud Honours Academy hosting us in the Netherlands, really showing us a lot of great techniques. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions. Oh, that's a great. Oh, yeah. Sorry. So, well, I could repeat the question. She was curious why we chose the specific delta, or the delta that you just saw before in Indonesia, for our specific case. That was very client-driven. So the Delta Alliance there are a few partners that they are working with. And they're very interested in this case in Indonesia. And there is a team from a university there which will be very, critical to us working on the problems there. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, 2 universities in Indonesia. Thank you.
And as we were there, of course, they explained a lot of background as well. So Indonesia is a former Dutch colony, and there's a lot of interest in what's going on over there. So they seem to have connections with the universities. And it was also interesting to make sure that the lessons learned would be something that you could transfer from, a country like the Netherlands to a country like Indonesia. So, we could come up with lots of solutions, but if they were, for want of a better word, a Cadillac solution, it might work in the Netherlands but not work in Indonesia. So that was part of the reason that I think they were really interested in seeing what could be done there.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering if you could explain your client, the Delta Alliance. Can you explain their structure, their purpose, who's involved, how they're funded, what their goals are?
Yeah, definitely. Is anybody? Yeah, I can definitely. They are a network. They are a network organization, is how they refer to themselves, and it is a nonprofit. So they are formed together in a nonprofit structure, and they're paired with various businesses as well as universities. So they are really a group that is attempting to put people together and to integrate the knowledge of a lot of different organizations. So it is not just in one spot in the world, and they are definitely international, really bringing together a lot of different players. I'm trying to think of the funding scheme at the moment, and I'm not sure exactly all of the funding that they're receiving, but I know as a nonprofit they're receiving a fair amount of grant money and these sorts of things. But yes, they do. They have a wonderful website if you look them up. Very beautiful Delta pictures as well, and really interesting descriptions of what they're doing.
And we haven't always been the ones who have been in direct contact. They have folks that are, that got the original grant for this program that deal with Delta Alliance, but I'm afraid we may not know all the details about that. So. More questions?
I was wondering if you guys could just comment on the differences you've noticed in approach from students in other places in the world, how they kind of approach the problem differently.
Yes. Well, okay.
Well, share the mic.
I think he asked how we've seen students, the international students, possibly approach this work differently. I think that the best thing that we've realized for this approach, because we are dealing with multiple universities across multiple timetables, is that we need lots of different approaches to communicating and to kind of realizing a common approach. And so we've been using a lot of Google Docs, we've been using Skype, we've using Adobe Connect. We've been, it's kind of an ongoing amount of really multimedia that has facilitated this process. And so I think that that's something that we all have in common. So for whatever reason, this age group, we're all very linked into the internet and to different tools. And we also use Facebook. And so anyway, so there's all these different multimedia tools that we're using to communicate. And I think that's really facilitated the process. Without that, I just don't know how it would have happened.
I think that we probably all have individual examples, and actually it's a really good question because I wondered in starting to work with some of these folks, I had actually been to one other program in the Netherlands where I saw folks working in a small group, but I hadn't really been involved in something that went on for so long, and then you went back to your own countries and you did video conferences and you tried to stay up on this process. And I think we've all found things that were somewhat surprising, like, some kind of different or some cultural differences in the way that they expect things to be organized. We started off with this little discussion group, and after a little while, it seemed like they seemed to be getting kind of frustrated talking on the discussion group, and they said, well, why don't you all get together and agree on what you're going to post as your discussion point, and then we'll agree on our point and you will compare points. And we're like, well, that's not how discussions work, at least not from our point of view. But from their point of view, they kind of...
We had many different multimedia ways of connecting.
Right.
We've kind of figured it out now. But.
So... yeah, and obviously that's kind of a down-in-the-weeds example. We all have different examples, but I just found some of those things to be interesting little experiences.
Oh, no, I mean, It's because people, there are so many of us, so when we're all posting on these forums, it's like, where do I look? So that was partly why we're like, let's try to have a, pull your questions, don't just fire them off one at a time, and that way, when people respond, you'll also kind of have it all at once.
Are there 30 of us?
There are, about 30 total, or around there. 27. Yvonne knows. Any other questions? Do you want to say anything?
Thank you, guys. Can you talk a little bit more about the spring school, what it is and who's involved, and just repeat what you hope to accomplish?
Thanks, Jeannie, for the question. And the spring school is a reprise and an advancement over what we did in the summer school, which was to, first of all, get oriented and find out what are some of the wicked problems in the region, which they presented on. There were other ones, too, that we went to, the Delta Works, and some of the interesting problems that you have when you hold back seawater and create freshwater lagoons in areas that shouldn't be freshwater, and the eutrophication problems that happen. There were a number of examples that they exposed us to literally. And the Dutch were very hospitable. I mean, they took us all over the country. They had great coffee and great food. And so we have already a standard to live up to in the spring school, just in terms of hospitality. One of the things we're hoping to do is to also introduce some of the wicked problems that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. So one of them is the issue of dam removal, and how do we accommodate removing, like the Condit Dam, a recent example, or the Elwha. How do you accommodate that problem, and how do you satisfy the stakeholders in the region? How do you accomplish ecological goals, such as restoration of salmonid runs, at the same time satisfying, or at least not totally torquing off, the people who depend on different fisheries, whether they be lake fisheries or ocean fisheries, and accommodating and navigating all those needs with the tribal concerns as well as other concerns. And these are the kinds of concerns, you don't have these in the Netherlands, so very different. And they've had some very integrative, interesting solutions that they presented to us. And so we want to also expose them in the spring school to some of those problems. And then you have to put into context that we're dealing with a country like Indonesia that's suffering so much more grave problems in the delta regions concerning human mortality, not just fish mortality. And so there's yet another order of magnitude of seriousness, I think, in accommodating and trying to understand how to make a framework that's flexible enough to deal with these kinds of, super serious problems. So, in terms of the spring school, what we're hoping to do is, first of all, introduce our various colleagues from around the world to some of our problems here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly visiting a dam removal site, going to the coast and seeing some of the issues that we have there, particularly with fisheries and collapse of fisheries, that kind of thing. And then we're going to just roll up our sleeves and get to work on furthering these documents that they've been working on now for 6 months or more. I guess it's been more. And then trying to come up with some kind of a solution, some kind of a document that's all-encompassing, that actually has an application to the Indonesian problem of waterborne diseases and deltas. It's kind of a big task.
So I understand that you are trying to develop a new framework which combines the natural step approach with the kind of the sustainable development framework, looking at the environmental, social, economic, and cultural aspects. I was wondering whether you have been thinking about the institutional arrangement or the institutional dimensions of the work that you are doing, and if so, could you give some examples? Have you been looking at any specific frameworks, or is it implied under, I don't know, the social piece that you are also going to consider the institutional arrangements?
So that's a really good comment. And we are within the framework for strategic sustainable development. Within that process, they too talk about institutions a lot and about how to I guess, facilitate the process through institutions or with institutions. I can't speak to that directly because I don't have that expertise, but within our group we do have people that have expertise in that realm, and I do know that the natural step or the framework for strategic sustainable development does speak directly to that. However, I think if you would want to come to our spring school and talk a little bit about it, I know you have a large breadth of knowledge. It would be very valuable.
Thanks, Bressa, for the question. And I just also want to add to Sarah's comment that in the spring school, we are inviting, in the process of inviting community partners who will help inform our thinking quite a bit, hopefully, on that. Some of that happened in the Netherlands in dealing with some of the ministry people in various places that we visited, how they accommodate both, as was mentioned in the Overdeep polder, how they accommodated local farming interest, but that was a ministry level project that was able to integrate the grassroots of that. Yvonne Chang could talk about that at length because I know she's been doing a lot of work on that. And so the institutional challenges, but also opportunities, are to try to, help those institutions understand these problems and go beyond their boundaries within their institutions to come up with solutions that incorporate citizen concerns as well as institutional level concerns, and also incorporate economic well-being of the people as well as ecological sustainability.
Between all of the schools, the Swedish students and staff are actually a part of a master's program in strategic leadership, which also kind of gets at institutional change and organizational development and kind of progressing those avenues. It is a little to the side of maybe directly what the principles state, but it applies. And Robert, and the German school, the University of Duisburg in Essen, also there are strengths there from the coursework and the faculty that they work with that we're drawing on.
So what I think is interesting here is you guys are seeing one part of this huge beast that we've created, this huge group, and so we're just like one piece of the brain, and so it's kind of interesting because there are a lot of these different things that are encompassed in what we're doing, and I wish we had our people here to back us up. But yeah, we've been very focused on ecosystem services, as well as urban stream syndrome and other ecological effects. So that's kind of our main focus of this group here.
Hi. I wonder if you could talk a little bit or highlight a couple of other kind of successful trade-off stories, like the farmers in the Netherlands.
Well, one that we directly experienced when we were there was talking about climate change and the fact that we have the sea level rise. And so there is extensive control of water in and out of the deltas in the Netherlands. And part of this control process, at one time, they thought that they didn't realize the types of trade-offs that would be involved with literally cutting the estuary in half and not allowing that salt water to flow into the delta region. And Alan touched on this already, but as you can imagine, by cutting that salt water out of the delta, they had huge ecological trade-offs that they weren't expecting. And so they are currently trying to deal with this and try to realize how they can control the water and avoid flooding and avoid, especially now it's going to be more dramatic with climate change, while lessening the ecological trade-offs that they have made by cutting off the saltwater flow. So that's one that we did experience that we didn't touch on specifically in our presentation. There are a few more. Does anyone want to?
Well, I think, so just to speak to kind of the need for a process to make sure that they make good decisions that don't solve one problem and then cause another. Sarah's mentioning this whole issue of kind of blocking some of these estuaries. They had these large floods in the 50s. I think 1959 had a large flood, and they decided they were going to put these big barriers across the mouths of certain rivers where they entered the sea, which did solve one problem, some of the sea flooding. But then as they were preparing to close this last huge estuary, a lot of the fishermen were literally started engaging in civil disobedience, trying to block the project, because they said, if you do this, it's going to destroy this whole ecosystem. And they were in the process of building something that, had they talked with all of the people there first, it probably would have been cheaper. But instead, they had already started building a dam that was just going to close it off. And what they did instead is they built a surge barrier with movable plates, these giant steel plates that could be moved up and down. And when there's a storm surge, they can put them down. When there's a situation where, under normal circumstances, they hang the plates up and the water flows through and the fish continue to migrate, and, it's a living system. So I think that they realized that there was a need for engaging people. And they showed us an example in the southern part of the country where there are some conflicts right now, and some people are not choosing to be engaged. They are, they're agreeing. At first, they agreed to flood the small area, and then the farmers basically went to politicians and tried to get them to renege on the deal, and basically the opposite of what happened at Overdeep Stakeholder. Instead of a grassroots effort that really tried to figure out a good solution to the process, some people will try to short-circuit this. So we're trying to look at, if there's a framework in place and a process in place, how can you get a better outcome for everybody?
And that really large barrier, I think that's a picture of it right there. So, yeah, in the group photos that were collaged together, we were on top of it. And we actually, you can enter inside the whole structure and walk through it. Kind of see all the, the levers and wheels that are used to lower and raise the gates.
We're developing, within this document, we're creating case studies to talk about these trade-off stories. And so as the document is complete, we're going to have more robust stories about these sorts of trade-offs and maybe ones that we didn't directly witness while we were in the Netherlands. So just look forward to that, I would say.
Just a really neat fact about the story that Sarah was telling earlier about the barrier, the actual dike that could, they actually have locks in the Netherlands, and I didn't realize this was possible, that actually do not let the salt water in. Like, they literally have a big pool of water, one half is fresh and one half is salty, and I found that fascinating. And so that was a huge success story when they had a very eutrophied freshwater system on one side, and they were able to work together to say, no, you know what, we're really going to let the salt water back into the system, and it cleared it up ecologically just like that. It was pretty fascinating. Over, I think, like a few weeks or like a month, it was really amazing.
However, there are a lot of social trade-offs in that situation because you can see here that there is a lot of areas where the water is blocked. And this is the Delta region. And some areas where they are talking about doing this, allowing the saltwater to enter into the freshwater, there's a lot of pushback because this saltwater intrusion can be expensive for replacing equipment due to corrosion, and there's a lot of pushback, especially in Rotterdam. We witnessed some presentations talking about these trade-offs they were going to have to make to allow this reemergence of saltwater. So again, these are complicated problems, and there isn't one solution, and they're still working on adapting these solutions.
I just wanted to mention one last thing on that. Sorry, Yvonne. And that was how refreshing it was to hear from the local farming community in the presentation that they gave to us on the Overdeep polder. We had maybe a crusty farmer come, and he started to try to speak in English, and he just went to the Dutch. And, of course, we don't understand Dutch. So there was, at first, a communication block. But then the laughter that he was evoking from our Dutch host was pretty contagious. And he was talking about, instead of maybe what you might find, I come from Oklahoma, and there's, the certain red state phenomenon. What you find in recalcitrance of adopting or dealing with climate change, he was just the opposite. It was like, we are crazy if we don't take these steps. This was the translation. And it was just very refreshing to hear the grassroots, the local farming community say, look, environmental change is on us, and the government has given us this possibility of changing, and therefore they were embracing it. So I just found that very refreshing. I don't know if that's exactly a trade-off story, but it's just it's a different approach. And it points to the context difference of different places and why it's important to get different countries and people with different backgrounds and different environmental problems that we're all facing, different contexts for those problems together.
So I understand this to be a type of learning, and I'm curious about what you're getting out of this type of learning that maybe you will be taking with you out into the world as you're becoming professionals in dealing with these complexities.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting experience. I mean, obviously, even having worked on a lot of different projects, done project management, and a lot of what I feel I contribute to this is kind of on a, theory level of, how do you manage different systems, how do you put things together. I still hadn't really dealt with people from so many different cultural backgrounds and having to put together so many perspectives. And I think that this final process of putting it all together, we're going to have to go a step beyond that because we're going to have to figure out people's priority levels, how important is one thing versus another. So there are tools for that, there are ways to facilitate those conversations. So it'll just be interesting to see exactly what the appropriate tools are for dealing with that.
I don't really have anything profound to say, but one just response is, and kind of goes back to what Alan was saying, was of context. So in working with people from other countries, just really realizing that we might be concerned about salmon and river restoration, and someone else might be concerned about clean water. And then when you come together and work on issues, just being sensitive to that sort of contextual situation. And I think that came out quite a bit in our when we were there, and communication styles and that sort of thing. So not really profound, but one learning piece.
Yeah, and I think as we're communicating and writing emails to one another or posting little messages on all the different options for multimedia that we're using, you have to be very clear in your language and definitely make sure the point you're making is clear, which I think was initially maybe one of the reasons why when Kelly told that earlier story of where they were like, just, pare it down, parse it down, like to the key points, like that is definitely, the information reduction management of what you're conveying to other people is really critical.
I'm kind of to speak to that point, I think something that I'm really getting out of this is just that realization that, when you're working in an interdisciplinary group, you have to create a common language. But when you're working in a multicultural interdisciplinary group, you really need to realize that there's this common language transition that you need to go through. And so you need to have those miscommunications and good communications to create a common language that you can all work around, or a structure to move forward in kind of reaching your goal. And I think that a lot of times there isn't enough emphasis on that process and how long that takes and how complicated it is, but it's really rewarding in the end.
So I'm just curious, I couldn't really tell on a scale level. I was fascinated that there was even a project called Room for the River and that it was government funded, and I'm trying to picture that like from an EPA standpoint, like would they do that for the Mississippi? Like what scale of river are we talking about?
Ooh. No, Yvonne, feel free to chime in too. I think it's large scale. I mean, this is certainly a big deal. I think what was so fascinating to me was that it's a national concern, and it seemed like they did have a lot of buy-in from people nationally, which kind of compared to this country, I don't know that we have that. Can't think of many instances where you would have that, and maybe that's just the climate change issue is so huge there. So do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I've been working on the Room for the River project. I'm a facilitator there. I'm an American, but I'm also Dutch. And the one thing as an American that I realized is water there is national security. People lose their homes, they lose their businesses. I don't know how many have died from, but it's such a major issue there, and I think that's really different than here in the U.S. So until it is something, water and how we deal with water and how much it affects all of our lives is raised to that level, there we have it naturally because it's national security. What makes it different with it being national security is they have a huge amount of clout. So the different government branches that manage water, I had to deal with like 3 different ministries that are dealing with water, and each of them looks at the water differently. It's traffic for one, it's natural and agriculture for another. So there's many, many different ways to look at it. But when you have that amount of complexity for something that affects all of the country so much, they figure out, their own ways to work together. And we have something there, it's called the polder model, which basically means you have a lot of different voices trying to work together on a common issue. And that's kind of part of the culture there. So I think that is a real different thing here than also in the United States. I don't know if that helps.
Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering what was all of your backgrounds, like what did you do your master's on, or what was your undergrad? And I mean, are you more from political science perspective or biology, or?
I'll just start since I have it. We're all different. I'm a landscape architect, landscape ecologist, and so a lot of these issues are really in line with things I've worked on with restoration work, specifically in aquatic environments. So does that answer your question for me? Okay.
My background is biology and ecology, and I worked on invasive species, aquatic invasive species, before I got my master's, which is a professional MEM, environmental management master's.
My background is in environmental science as well. I just finished my master's last year here at PSU, and I was specifically working on wetland restoration effectiveness in the lower Columbia River. And so my continued interest is working in restoration in these wet areas and urbanizing places because they're very complicated.
I have a degree in marine biology, which is where I started, and then moving into a Master's of Environmental Management, where I started to look at marine spatial planning and non-consumptive recreational use on the Oregon coast, and now currently moving into the Urban Studies department here, looking at replacement ecosystem services, so kind of a progression from the ocean to the city.
And my background's probably one of the most different. So I'm mainly from a management background, but it's management of technology and engineering technology management that has focused on how to apply solutions to solve problems that are often related to sustainable development. So I've done a lot of work on renewable energy, low-impact hydropower. So that was kind of the segue into this particular project for me. One interesting thing is that, I felt like I was initially going to be dealing with a lot more technology-specific problems. At first, they were mentioning, these things like the Oostershelter barrier, and I thought we were going to go and talk about these and what some of the options were and analyze it, but it's really turned out to be more of a theoretical process and a project management process. So I think you can bring a lot of different skills into these things and approach them in different ways.
And I'll also just comment that the other teams look very different as well. We have people on our team that are in criminal law, as well as neurobiology. We have some political scientists as well that are on the team. So they really cast a wide net to try to get just a lot of different perspectives on this project. So really fascinating. If there are no more questions, I think it looks like we're just about done with time. So thank you again for listening.